Thank you, Rabbi Miriam. It's an honor to be here with you and to be here with this remarkable community of people pursuing contemplative practice on a regular basis. As I was telling Rabbi Miriam, I sit in on these periodically. I've taught them periodically, and I'm always amazed and heartened that so many people come on a daily basis to engage in this practice, not only to sit, but also to learn and to be in community. This has been valuable, obviously, not only through COVID, when it was really hard to be physically present to each other, but it continues to be important for all of us. It's become another built-in way to learn, sit, and experience the miracle of life in community. So today I want to talk to you, teach and learn with you briefly before we sit about silence. And it's very propitious that I'm doing so, because it turns out that Rabbi Miriam will be leading a course beginning in mid-November on sacred listening. And I didn't really know about this until I saw that she was going to be hosting today's sit. There's information on it on the IJS website. I'm actually going to drop it into the chat right now. And I'm so glad that Rabbi Miriam and that the Institute for Jewish Spirituality are focusing attention on the central quality of listening, and of silence, the ground of all listening, which I want to learn and sit with you about today. So to begin with, I want to begin with a quote from that great Jewish philosopher, René Descartes, an honorary Jew, to be sure, the 16th and 17th century philosopher, who said, "All our ills come from man being unable to sit alone quietly in a room." I think there's a profound truth to this remark that points to the fact that silence is frightening for us in the modern West generally. And the evidence of that is that we have surrounded ourselves with noise. Now, noise isn't necessarily the opposite of silence, but it does serve as a kind of blanket or a protective shield from the silence that is the substrate of all existence and all being. And if we can sink into silence today, even for a few moments, we can give ourselves the chance to begin to cultivate the profound listening that Torah talks about, that Rabbi Miriam will be teaching about, and that is the basis for the miraculous awareness of being alive from moment to moment and in contact with the divine, however we perceive and experience that. Another great Jewish philosopher, the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, said that silence, the silence that counts, is a listening silence. And he added that listening is the supreme religious act. And I think this is particularly true in Judaism, as we learn each week, and as we learned in the Torah portion last week, that Shema, the root Shin Mem Ayin, speaks not only about hearing or listening, but about a full body experience of being receptive, of taking in, of being responsive. And these are skills that Judaism calls upon us to practice, to deepen, not only alone, but in community. And that's what I hope to do with us today. So now I'm going to share a study sheet, and we're just going to look briefly at a few texts before we go together, sort of in the bathysphere of silence, and sink down into the oceanic depth of the silence that we can experience. So hold on for a second while I get the correct page up. The text that we'll be meditating on today is from the beginning of Psalm 65. L'manatzeach mizmor David. Here's the phrase we'll be focusing on. Lecha dumia tihila. Silent, typically translated as, although we'll talk about the many different aspects of this phrase, Silence to you is praise. It's translated here on Sepharia as praise befits you. Lecha dumia tehila Elokim b'Tzion. Silence to you is praise in Zion, O God. So if silence is praise, we have to ask ourselves, if we are praising existence and the source of all existence, how might we do so? And our texts, our wisdom texts and our tradition, which is so full of words, and don't get me wrong, words of wisdom, how do we dive deeper into silence? Part of the lack of silence comes from an experience of kotzer ruach, of having a crushed spirit. But kotzer ruach can also be translated as shortness of breath, of a constriction of breathing. This passage from Exodus, when Moses tells the Israelites that he is there on behalf of God to free them from their bondage, they would not listen. Velo sham'u el Moshe mi kotzer ruach. They couldn't hear Moses because of their shortness of breath, the constriction of their spirit. So sometimes our constrictions block us off from silence. This text from Pirkei Avot is a beautiful teaching, and it comes from Shimon, the son of Rabban Gamliel, one of the great rabbinic leaders of the earliest years of the Common Era. And his name, Shimon, indicates that deep hearing and deep listening are an essential part of who he is and who he has come to be. Shimon used to say, all my days I grew up among the sages, and I have found nothing better for a person than silence. He goes on to say a most radical thing for the son of a great rabbinic leader. Study, he says, is not the most important thing, but actions. And whoever indulges in too many words brings about sin. This places silence as an ultimate spiritual and religious value in Judaism. Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, says that there's a time for everything famously. And one of the things that there's a time for is a time for silence. Et lishchot ve'et ledaber, a time for silence and a time for speaking. This means, to me, and something that we might explore together, that there must be a time for silence. Judaism is, I would say, a dialectical tradition, meaning we can't always aim for the same state and hope to stay in that state perpetually. But if we set aside times for being in particular states, we will deepen our experience of all states. Remember that the phrase we're going to meditate on from Psalm 65 is Lecha dumia tehila. The word dumia is interesting because it shares a root with words that mean something slightly different from silence, including similarity, domeh, to be similar to. So in a way, Lecha dumia tehila could mean silence is like you, God. If we play with the root a little bit, Lecha dumia tehila b'Tzion. God, you are like the silence in Zion. And if any of you have ever been to Israel, you know that there are places of majestic, even towering silence. And if we practice imitatio Dei, the imitation of the divine, one way to pursue it is to be in majestic silence. This famous passage from the first book of Kings is about the prophet Elijah coming out of a cave after he has fled from Jezebel and hearing kol demama daka, a thin momentary voice of silence, a thin voice of silence. It's often translated as a still small voice. Here Sepharia translates it as a soft murmuring sound. But notice the similarity in the roots of the Hebrew word, kol demama daka, a voice that is silent. This seems to us on the surface to be a contradiction, but in actual fact, it points to a voice that is constantly speaking to us through silence. Finally, I want to look at this text before we meditate. Rabbi Abahu said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, when the Holy Blessed One gave the Torah, no bird twittered, no fowl flew, no ox lowed, none of the Ophanim stirred a wing. The seraphim did not say, Kadosh, Kadosh, holy, holy. The sea did not roar. The creatures did not speak. Rather, the whole world was hushed into breathless silence, and then the voice went forth, I am Adonai, your God. All of this leads us to understand, I hope, or to at least be able to approach the notion that silence is the substrate of the I-thou experience, of deep encounter, not only between us and the divine, but between us and our living conscious selves, and between ourselves and each other. When we go deeply into this meditation, I will guide you toward the still small voice, the kol demama daka, from which we can truly say, Lecha dumia tehila. So now I invite you to drop into your body, to focus on your posture, to settle away from your head and into your breath. Take a moment to settle, to focus on spine, lengthening, on breath, deepening and evening, and on muscles, letting go. Our meditation together is an exercise in letting go. If you have a physical locus for excessive effort, strain to understand, gently move warmth and forgiveness toward that physical place. For me, it's right between the eyes. Those furrows that form in the brow when you're straining to hear, straining to understand. Drop a stone of forgiveness into that place of tension and let the ripples move the tension away. As you do this with me, begin to turn your focus to your hearing, away from thoughts of, am I doing this right? How many minutes are left? Did I leave that thing in the oven? Did I miss that appointment? And toward the sounds that you're hearing right now. As you drop in, notice the layers of sound. Notice when you focus that sounds come forth to meet you from different layers of experience, outside, inside. Air conditioners, fan in the computer, birds outside, but also inside your body. Hold these two things, the sound and deep and even breathing. When attention wanders, as it inevitably will, come back to the breathing and the hearing. Eyes softly open or gently closed. We focus on one word at a time of the phrase Lecha Dumia Tehillah. Silence is praise to you, or silence is your song. Lecha, the connection between you and me, between you and God, between you and all of us, between each of us and all that is. Lecha. This lecha is both outside of you and inside of you, both you and other than you, and is there in the silence within and right next to you. Dumia, the silence itself, our silence, which is domeh, similar to God's silence, to the silence of all existence that undergirds all. Tehillah, the song itself, the song of praise that is at the foundation of all hearing. If you can hear, and if you can listen deeply, you will hear the kol damama daka, the thin sound of momentary silence, which is the blood running past your eardrums. That thin, whispering, rushing sound, a high-pitched tone, is the sound of your life lifing. This is the sound of your body and your consciousness praising existence. Tehillah, the song of praise of presence and existence. To conclude with me, let's breathe deeply and hear our breathing deeply. Breathe in with me for a count of 4, which I will count. Hold for a count of 4 if you're able, and exhale for a count of 4. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Breathe out. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now let your lungs spring open and take one more moment to hear the Kol Damama Daka that praises your existence. And now if your eyes are closed, open them. If they're gently open, open them all the way. And rejoin us here in this community of sacred listeners. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. At this time, we'll have the Mourner's Kaddish prayer for mourning placed on the screen, and you can place in the chat those whom you're saying Kaddish for today, if you are, and their relationship to you, if you like. And you can please unmute, and from the silence, we can hear together the sounds of each other's voices who are reciting Kaddish today. And I invite you to stand if you're able, or in body and spirit, as you're able and as you like. We'll say the Kaddish together and bear witness if you are not saying Kaddish today. Yitkadal, B'Yikadal,
Amen.
Say shalom,
Shalom Dimrum,
Amen.
So for all those who are said Kaddish today, may your loved ones' memories be for blessing. And again, to Joanne Fink, Joanne Observing Yahrzeit, for your husband, Andy, may his memory be for blessing and may his soul be uplifted by our practice together today. So at this time, if you need to be going on about your day, thank you so much for joining your practice with our practice here today. I hope to see you tomorrow or soon again back here. And if you're able to stay, we're going to move now into some time to join in from a root of silence and the silence that filled our practice with David's guidance, conversation, questions you may have for David that arose for you in the sit today, or comments that you'd like to share. You're welcome now. We're opening the chat. Chat will remain open rather. And so please feel free to put your questions here for David. And David, again, I want to thank you so much for lifting up, as you have so beautifully and clearly, the centrality of silence as foundational in the religious life and in Jewish life and practice. And I wrote down a couple of things that you shared that really struck me as you expanded on that verse from Psalms, that for you, God, silence is praise, is like you, is of the essence. Now I'm extrapolating.
Mm-hmm.
You said towards the beginning of your teaching that when we are in a state of kultzer ruach, or contraction of spirit, which is like also the shortened breath, it's a lot harder, if not impossible, to hear and deeply listen. And I was wondering if you might be able to share some thoughts as practice guidance, maybe from your own practice, your experience. If we find ourselves in that contracted state, we know we want to get to sort of, that deeper breath and kind of soften to be able to listen. How do we work with that? How do we work with the constriction in our practice?
It's a wonderful question. I'm so grateful you asked it. The general and perhaps slightly evasive answer, although I don't mean it to be, is that for everyone, there's a different modality, a different way in. And part of the virtue of practice is that you find that way in for yourself. For me, recently, I've really been working on hearing and listening, which was why it was important to me to share this practice. But for some, there may be a different way, a reading of Psalms, or an experience of nature, or an experience of kinesthetic embodied physical effort. The key is, the two keys for me that I tried to share today are expansiveness of breath, because literally the spirit and the breath move in unison. I find when my spirit is constricted, when I'm gyroscoping out of balance, when I'm stressed, that my breathing exists in a very narrow range, and I have to step outside the drama of the momentary experience and really focus on expanding the rib cage, dropping the shoulders, softening the scowl that happens here, and opening the breathing. But lately too, for me, it is shutting out the noise that we surround ourselves in the Western world. And to me, this means not only all the layers of sound that exist even in a quiet room with electric appliances and that sort of thing, but also taking out the AirPods, turning off the music, all the things that you said at the beginning that you gently reminded us to do, the phone, the notifications, all the noises that remind us to be who we are have to be gently excused. And that is a route that I find very useful in gently dissolving kultivate ruach.
That's so helpful. And I want to lift up one of the aspects of what you said, which is about the somatic aspect. It's like shifting focus from the thinking mind into physical experience in the moment.
Right. And hearing is so important to that activity, because ironically, our hearing faculties are located right where our brain is, but they attach to a much deeper experience. So it can really reintegrate the brain into the full wonder of experience without overheating the thinking mind.
So yes, now Nancy asked a wonderful and really important question. How would you frame this teaching for the deaf community?
I think it's a really important question. And I'm grateful that Nancy asked it. And when I was preparing this exercise, I was thinking a lot about that, because for a short time I studied in Chicago at the Hebrew Seminary for the Deaf, which ordains rabbis who are trained to minister to the deaf community. I did some text study and studied Hebrew language there. And the important thing to know about how this too can reach the deaf community is that hearing is not only a somatic experience. Hearing is a deep spiritual experience, number one. So even if someone is completely deaf, the the hearing function extends to one's own ruach, one's own inner world, one's ability to connect to the outer world through a variety of sensory apparatus. So for people even who are completely deaf, hearing extends to the ability to deeply perceive what's happening. I have a deaf friend in college who told me, "You think I can't hear, but I hear deeply, just not the way that you do." And I think part of what she meant, as I entered into conversation with her about this, was not only in her case was she not 100% physically deaf, but all her other senses had been trained to accommodate deep levels of receptivity that didn't even make up for, but augmented the ability to perceive in the world. So silence is different than noise, and hearing is different than the ability to physically hear. We all have the inner noise, and we all have the ability to train ourselves to receive in deeper and less troubled ways. I hope that's helpful.
Oh, so beautiful. I think so helpful, David. And that word receptivity, the receptivity is a quality that is not dependent upon only the physical sensory capacities. Is that, yeah. I want to get to a couple more questions, wonderful questions, David, for you. Ricky asks, when we're in the midst of noise and a chaos that we can't control, have you also created a listening practice that can help us find a path to calm, which is different from breath, perhaps, a way to work with or use the noise?
Yes. For those of you who first of all, when I was hearing this question, I immediately defaulted to remembering living in New York City and just the sheer amount of noise that you live with, not just in New York, but in really in any city. The amount of noise that just enters you and the shields that you build up really can sort of occlude the receptivity to silence even in the midst of that noise. To experience hearing on this level is to be able to find crevices of silence even within the noise. And again, this is not only a physical somatic experience, but it is a kind of spiritual listening. To hear even in the midst of an immense din, whether it's in nature or in the urban world or somewhere in between. To feel life lifing and to feel the world worlding is to experience the silence. Now, in a way, I understand that this is an abstract idea, but even if you just think about silence when walking past a construction site, you will have a radically different experience of the noise. And this is how I think that practice reflects the comment that I think is that you just read to me.
It's I'm hearing really you're stressing again, I'm going to refer back to that word that you raised before, David, the receptivity.
Mm-hmm.
I'm hearing that, just be softening to receive what the moment is offering, whatever the moment, including this moment.
Yes.
My house, the leaf blower outside,
yeah, right.
as well as the birds and the ding from here, this, that, and the other, that there's a quality that you cultivate within yourself through practice.
Absolutely. Very important. Yeah. This receptivity. It's important for us to realize that so much of our technological, all of the things that we surround ourselves with and all the civilization that cradles us is in response on some level to a deep fear on our part, a vulnerability, a fear of how transitory and soft and vulnerable we are. And we close ourselves off. This is an experience of opening back up, a practice, a discipline of opening back up.
Yeah. Folks are I think, write some beautiful comments about what others here, some of us are noticing, like Manny writes, I silence the floodgates of creativity open wide and we hear. Gail writes, I find that living alone, not in a noisy city environment, if it is silent in my home for a long time, I become uncomfortable and have a need to either turn on music or background radio or something. And I wonder, it strikes me, the kindness in that, as well as how to be kind with ourselves, even as we practice.
Very much so. And I notice, I'm noticing too in the comments questions about, like Rona writes about, what about persistent tinnitus? So sometimes the hearing itself or issues or problems with the hearing present a barrier, or sometimes overemphasize the thin, small voice of silence. And how do we practice through that? To me, this goes back to the comment I made a little bit earlier about hearing being a fully embodied experience. In terms of the trilateral root of Shema, hearing is not just what comes in through the ears, but it is the full body receptivity of moment-to-moment experience. And tinnitus, which I have had, is crazy making. So it is the way that I practiced and would practice with that is to focus on receptivity through pores, through eyes, through knees, through skin, so that the physical, biological act of hearing itself is not the focus of hearing.
That's so powerful, David. So you're not cutting off from the practice, but it's like working with what's happening in the body at the moment.
Exactly.
Like a detour in order to
come back around.
Yeah, beautiful. Anna writes, sometimes I take out my hearing aids just to be closer to silence.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
An aid to hearing is taking out the hearing aid.
That's right. Right. It is a totally different experience of hearing.
Well, David, we have about 1 minute left while we could be going on. I feel this is such a rich conversation, and we could expand it out further with some shared silence in between the words. But I'm wondering if there are some last words that you might like to leave us with before we bid goodbye today.
I so appreciate the opportunity to, Rabbi Miriam, to be here with you and with this deeply listening community. As a practice, I think the challenge for deep listening is to always put oneself in new and uncustomary situations where new patterns of deep receptivity have to be experienced. It's vulnerable and it's sometimes unpredictable, but to deeply hear oneself and others, practice deep hearing even in the midst of uncomfortable or new situations. This builds the muscle of deep receptivity and deepens the silence when you sink into it in contemplative practice.
Thank you so much for that wisdom and that practice guidance. We should all maybe practice that as we go from here and get curious. Thank you so much, David. And thank you to everyone for being part of this community today. Blessings. And David, look forward to seeing you next time you'll be back with us. And to all of us, your next opportunity to practice with us again. Maybe it's tomorrow at 12:30 Eastern. Thank you so much, everybody.